In the dry, dusty land of Arizona, Caleb Harris lived a quiet and lonely life on his ranch. The ranch was far from the nearest town, and the long, hot days seemed to stretch endlessly, like the barren landscape around him. Caleb had inherited the ranch from his father, but after many years of hard work, it was no longer the thriving place it once was. His cattle herd had grown smaller, and the barn that had once been full of activity was now empty and weathered by time. Caleb was a man of few words, and even fewer people came to visit. The town was a long ride away, and Caleb rarely ventured there. He had never been one to enjoy crowds or company. He preferred the quiet of the desert, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the distant calls of wild animals. But there was something missing, something he had not spoken about in years. It had been many years since Caleb's life had been changed forever. A deep scar ran across his face, starting just below his left cheek and ending near his jaw. The scar was a constant reminder of the violent past that had shaped him into the man he was today. He had never talked about it with anyone. No one had asked, and he never volunteered the story. It was a part of him now, like the desert and the ranch, something that would always be there, whether he liked it or not. Years ago, Caleb had been part of a violent conflict between settlers in the Apache tribe. His younger brother Isaac had been killed in one of the raids. It was a loss that had torn Caleb apart. Isaac had been his only family, the only person who truly understood him. The memory of that day was still fresh in Caleb's mind, even though it had happened so long ago. He had carried that grief along with the scar for all these years. After the attack, Caleb had vowed never to let anyone close again. He couldn't bear the thought of losing someone else. So, he focused on the ranch, keeping to himself and avoiding any connections with others. He found comfort in the routines of his day, feeding the animals, fixing fences, and caring for the land. But in the stillness of the desert, there were times when loneliness crept into his heart. He longed for a sense of belonging, for someone to talk to, for a family. But he pushed those feelings aside, not allowing himself to think about them for too long. One warm afternoon, as Caleb was working in the barn, he noticed a figure on the horizon. At first, he thought it was just another mirage, a trick of the heat. But as the figure grew closer, he saw that it was two women walking slowly toward the ranch. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He had not expected any visitors, especially not in the middle of the desert. He quickly wiped his hands on his worn trousers and stepped outside, his eyes squinting in the bright sunlight. The women appeared to be Apache, dressed in simple, faded clothing. Their dark hair was braided and adorned with small beads, and their skin had the sun-kissed tone of those who had spent their lives under the harsh desert sun. Caleb's first instinct was to retreat into the safety of his cabin. His past with the Apache had been filled with violence, and he knew how dangerous they could be. He had heard stories of raids and attacks, of settlers being killed in cold blood. The last thing he wanted was to get involved in another confrontation. But as the women came closer, Caleb noticed something unusual. They weren't carrying weapons, nor did they seem threatening in any way. They walked with quiet confidence, but there was a sense of vulnerability in their movements. Caleb hesitated, unsure of what to do. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. When they were within speaking distance, one of the women, a young girl with striking dark eyes, spoke first. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of something deeper. "We've traveled a long way," she said, her tone hesitant. "We need a place to rest." Caleb was taken aback. "What do you want here?" he asked, his voice rough from years of silence. The girl didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him in the eye, as though she were trying to read his soul. "We are not here to cause harm," she said. "We seek only shelter." Caleb's suspicion grew. He had heard stories of Apache raiders pretending to be harmless, only to strike when least expected. But there was something about these girls, something that didn't sit right with his instincts. They didn't seem dangerous, just lost. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange pull to help them. "What are your names?" Caleb asked, his voice still cautious but no longer as sharp as it had been before. I am Tala, the girl said, and this is my sister Ahuli. She gestured to the other girl who stood quietly by her side. Caleb nodded, still unsure of what to make of the situation. I don't have much to offer, he said slowly, but you're welcome to stay for a night. I'll give you food and water, but that's all. Tala's face softened, a flicker of relief in her eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. The two girls followed Caleb into the small cabin. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. Caleb offered them water and some bread, and they sat in silence, sharing the meal. Tala and Ahuli didn't speak much, but their eyes never left Caleb. They seemed to be studying him just as he was studying them. After a while, Tala spoke again. You have a scar, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It's not just any scar. It's the mark of a warrior. Caleb's heart tightened. How did she know? He had never spoken of the scar to anyone. It was a reminder of a painful past, one he had locked away deep inside himself. He didn't know how to respond to her words. He didn't want to talk about it. But Tala's eyes were full of understanding, and something about her made him feel like she wasn't just talking about the physical scar on his face. She was talking about the deeper scars, the ones that could only be seen by those who had also suffered. Before Caleb could say anything, Tala continued, You have lived through something terrible just as we have. She paused, her gaze intense. You know what it is like to lose someone you love. For a moment, Caleb was speechless. How could she know that? How could she understand the pain that had lived with him for so long? He looked at Tala, his eyes searching for answers, but she simply nodded, as though she had already read the story on his face. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't want to go down that road, didn't want to open those old wounds, but something about these two girls made him feel like he could. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing. If he could just let go of the pain he had carried for so long. The evening passed quietly, the three of them sitting together by the fire, sharing a sense of comfort that was long overdue in Caleb's life. He couldn't explain it, The next morning, Caleb woke to the soft sound of the wind brushing through the trees. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting a golden light over the ranch. It had been a long time since he had felt this at ease. The two girls, Tala and Ahuli, had stayed the night, resting in the small guest room he had prepared for them. Caleb had expected the silence between them to continue, but instead it had been filled with something unexpected, a quiet companionship. As he stepped outside to check on his cattle, Caleb couldn't help but notice how the ranch felt different now. The air seemed a little less empty, and the morning felt a little warmer. It was strange, really. He had been living alone for so many years, and the thought of sharing his space with anyone had always made him uneasy. Yet the girl's presence brought a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. Tala and Ahuli had woken early as well, and when Caleb returned from the fields, they were already outside, gathering firewood and tending to the small garden Caleb had barely managed to keep alive. The sight of them working with such purpose, their hands moving gracefully as they bent to their tasks, filled Caleb with a sense of admiration. He had never seen anyone take such care with the land, and yet these two girls, strangers to him only a day ago, seemed as though they had lived here for years. "Morning," Caleb called, approaching them. His voice felt rough, as though it hadn't been used much in the past few years. "Good morning," Tala replied, her voice calm but warm. She looked up from the basket she was filling with firewood. "The land is beautiful here," she said, her eyes scanning the wide expanse of the ranch. "It's peaceful." Caleb nodded. He hadn't really thought of it as peaceful in a long time. To him, the ranch was just land he had to work, a place to stay busy and avoid thinking about his past. But now, as he looked at it through Tala's eyes, he saw something different. It wasn't just a piece of land to survive on. It was a place of quiet beauty. "Do you know how to tend to the animals?" Caleb asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. He had always done everything himself on the ranch, and the thought of sharing the work was both strange and appealing. Tala smiled, nodding. Yes, we were taught to care for animals by our tribe. We learned how to care for horses, cattle, and even the small ones. She gestured to the chickens and goats near the barn. We can help if you like. Caleb hesitated. For years he had done everything himself. It was a way of keeping busy, of avoiding the loneliness that crept up when there was nothing to do. But now, with these two girls offering to help, he felt a strange pull to let them in. Maybe it was time to share the load. Maybe it was time to let someone else in, to see if things could be different. All right, Caleb said, his voice softer than he intended. If you know how, then I won't turn you away. There's work to be done. The rest of the morning passed with an ease Caleb hadn't expected. Tala and Ahuli worked beside him as though they had always been part of the ranch. Ahuli, the quieter of the two, handled the horses with a gentle touch, speaking softly to them as she led them into the stables. Tala helped Caleb with the cattle, her movements steady and confident as she guided the animals toward the grazing fields. For the first time in years, Caleb felt like he wasn't alone. The work, which had once seemed endless and exhausting, now felt like a shared effort, something they were all doing together. At lunch, the three of them sat down outside under the shade of a large tree, eating the bread and cheese Caleb had prepared earlier. The air was warm and the breeze carried the scent of the desert. Caleb didn't know why, but he felt more at peace than he had in a long time. It was as though the land itself was welcoming them, accepting their presence. Tala spoke as she ate, her voice thoughtful. You have a good life here, Caleb, she said. It's hard work, but it's honest work. I think you've built something special. Caleb glanced at her, surprised by the kindness in her words. I've just been getting by, he said, shrugging. I've had to. Tala looked at him with understanding in her eyes. We all do what we must to survive, but sometimes we need help. Sometimes it's okay to let others in. Her words hit Caleb harder than he expected. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone. But here, in the presence of these two Apache girls, he felt a crack in those walls. It wasn't something he could explain, but it was there. He wasn't sure if it was their kindness or their shared pain that connected them, but there was something about them that made him feel less alone. Ahuli, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. We've been traveling for a long time, she said softly. We came from the mountains, far to the north. We've seen much, but we've also seen kindness. We've seen people willing to help others, even when it's hard. That's what we are looking for. Caleb looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. You've been traveling alone? Tala nodded. Yes. We lost our family in a raid many years ago. We've been on our own since then. But we didn't want to live in fear anymore. We wanted to find peace. Caleb's heart ached at her words. He knew what it was like to lose family. He knew the pain of living with a memory that refused to fade. But he also understood the need for peace, the desire to heal from the wounds of the past. It was something he had been searching for too. I understand, Caleb said quietly. I've lost people too. I know what it's like to feel like there's no place left to go. But maybe we can find that peace together. Maybe this ranch could be a place for all of us. Tala smiled, and for the first time since their arrival, Caleb saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. We would be honored, she said. We can help you, and we can learn from each other. Caleb nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. It was a feeling he hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was living. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it didn't matter. Whatever came, they would face it together. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow across the ranch, Caleb realized something he hadn't expected. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a place of shared hope. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt like he might not be alone after all. As the days passed, Caleb's life began to change in ways he hadn't imagined. The once quiet and lonely ranch was now filled with the sounds of people. Tala and Ahuli working alongside him, talking to him, and even laughing. It was strange to Caleb at first. He had grown used to the silence, the endless hours of solitude, but somehow their presence had become a source of comfort rather than disturbance. Their help with the ranch work made the days easier, and their company filled the empty spaces in his heart. Despite their kindness, Caleb still kept a part of himself hidden. He never spoke much about his past. The scar that ran across his face, an ugly, jagged line from a violent encounter many years ago, was a reminder of a time he preferred not to revisit. The scar was more than just a physical mark. It represented a period of his life that he wished to forget. Yet no matter how much he tried to move on, it was always there, a part of him that could never be fully healed. One evening, after another long day of work, Caleb found himself sitting by the fire outside his cabin. The cool night air had settled in, and the stars above shone brightly, casting a peaceful glow over the land. Tala and Ahuli sat beside him, each lost in their own thoughts as they warmed their hands by the fire. For a moment the world seemed to slow down, and the three of them shared a quiet understanding. Caleb looked at the two girls, wondering what their story was. He knew they had lost their family, just like he had lost his brother. They had traveled far, looking for a place to call home, and they had found refuge here with him. But he hadn't asked much about their past, and they hadn't volunteered the details. Caleb didn't want to press them, not wanting to cause any pain, but a part of him felt the need to understand them better. To know what had led them to this point, it was Tala who broke the silence. "You don't talk much about yourself?" "Caleb," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Why is that?" Caleb stiffened, not expecting the question. He looked at her, trying to find the right words. The firelight flickered in her eyes, and there was something about her presence that made him feel like he could open up, even if just a little. "I've been alone for a long time," he said, his voice low. "And sometimes it's easier not to talk, not to remember." Tala nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I understand," she said quietly. "There are things I don't want to remember either. Things that still hurt." Caleb looked at her, his curiosity growing. He could see that she was holding something back, just as he was. But it was clear that they shared something deeper, a connection born of loss and pain. "You don't have to tell me," Caleb said, his voice gentle. "I know how hard it can be." Tala met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that Caleb hadn't noticed before. "I don't talk about it often," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think you'll understand." Caleb felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What do you mean?" Tala took a deep breath as if gathering the courage to speak. "Our family. We lost them in a raid. My father, my mother, and my little brother. I was only a child, and I was left alone with Ahuli. We had no one to turn to, no one to protect us. We wandered for years, trying to find a place where we could be safe." Caleb felt a pang of sympathy for Tala. He understood what it felt like to lose family, to feel like everything you once knew had been ripped away. But it wasn't just her story that stirred something in him. It was the quiet strength in her voice, the resilience that he saw in her eyes. It was the same resilience that had brought her to his ranch, the same strength that had helped her survive. "You're stronger than you know," Caleb said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not easy to survive, to keep going when everything feels lost." Tala gave him a small smile, but it was bittersweet. "We don't have a choice, do we? We keep going because there's no other way. We survive because that's what we've learned to do." Caleb nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the day his brother had been killed. He hadn't realized it until now, but Tala's words had struck a chord with him. He had been surviving for so long, but had he really been living? Had he truly allowed himself to heal from the wounds of his past? Or had he simply built walls around himself, keeping the pain locked away so he wouldn't have to face it? The fire crackled, the sound breaking the silence between them. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. He hadn't been prepared for this conversation, for the flood of emotions that were suddenly rising to the surface. But something about Tala's presence made him feel like it was time to face those old wounds, to stop running from them. "I have a scar," Caleb said suddenly, his voice quiet but steady. Tala and Ahuli both turned to him, their eyes filled with curiosity. Tala nodded. "I know. I saw it when we first arrived." Caleb's fingers instinctively reached up to touch the scar on his face. It was a habit, one he had developed over the years. He had never liked the scar. It was a constant reminder of the pain he had suffered, of the day everything had changed. "I got it during an attack," Caleb said, his voice heavy with memories. "A raid many years ago. My brother was killed in that attack. I was lucky to survive." Tala's eyes softened with empathy, and Ahuli remained silent, her expression unreadable. Caleb felt a pang of guilt, as though he were burdening them with his story. But it was too late to take it back now. The words were out, and the past was suddenly alive again, standing right there between them. "I never really healed from it," Caleb continued, his voice growing softer. "I've carried that scar not just on my face, but inside me. It's a reminder of what I lost, and sometimes it feels like I'm still stuck in that moment, still reliving it over and over." Tala reached out and placed a hand on Caleb's arm, a gesture of comfort. "You don't have to carry that alone anymore, Caleb. We're here. We understand." Caleb looked at her, surprised by the depth of her words. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just holding on to the past, he was sharing it, letting it go. He wasn't alone in his pain anymore. Tala's words lingered in the air, and Caleb felt a small crack form in the wall he had built around himself. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop letting the past define him. It was time to heal, to live again. For the first time, Caleb allowed himself to believe that he could find peace, that the scar on his face didn't have to be a symbol of pain forever. It could be a symbol of survival, of strength, of the possibility of new beginnings. And maybe, just maybe, he could begin to forgive himself and the world for what had happened all those years ago. As the fire burned low and the night grew deeper, Caleb realized that he wasn't alone anymore. He had found something far more precious than he could have ever imagined, a chance to heal, and people to walk with him on that journey. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed felt different for Caleb. There was a subtle change in the air, like the land itself was welcoming the three of them. The mornings began with shared tasks, the afternoons with laughter, and the evenings with quiet conversation by the fire. Tala and Ahuli had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch. Caleb's solitary existence, which had stretched on for so long, was now filled with the presence of others. It was a strange and comforting shift, though much of their time was spent. Working together, Caleb couldn't help but notice how the girls never spoke much about their past. There was a heavy silence between them, one that Caleb understood well. They both carried a history that had shaped them, just as he had been shaped by his own pain. But unlike him, the girls seemed to move through the world without the weight of their past constantly pulling at them. They had learned to survive, to keep going, no matter how much the past tried to hold them back. Tala, in particular, seemed to carry herself with a quiet strength. She had an old soul, one that seemed beyond her years. Ahuli, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved. Caleb often found her lost in her own thoughts, her eyes distant as if she were somewhere far away, remembering something from the past that no one else could understand. One afternoon, as Caleb was fixing a fence near the far end of the ranch, Tala came to join him. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground as she walked toward him, her steps purposeful but calm. "You're working hard today," Tala said, her voice breaking the silence between them. Caleb paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. "There's always work to do around here," he replied with a shrug. "Keeps the mind occupied." Tala nodded, but Caleb noticed a certain sadness in her eyes. She wasn't just talking about the work. There was something more in her words, something unspoken. He wondered if she too was feeling the weight of the silence that had settled over them all. "You know," Tala continued, her voice soft, "sometimes I think about what it would be like if we could just forget the past. If we could just move forward without all the pain holding us back." Caleb looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He had spent years trying to move past his own pain, trying to forget the loss of his brother and the anger he had carried with him. But it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. It was a part of him, just as much as the land and the scar on his face. "I don't think we can ever forget," Caleb said quietly. "The past is a part of us, whether we want it to be or not. But maybe we can learn to live with it, to find a way to move forward despite it." Tala met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "I used to think that the pain would never end," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But sometimes, I think maybe there's more to life than just surviving. Maybe there's a chance for something better." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat at her words. He had never allowed himself to hope for something better. The loss of his brother had closed him off from the possibility of a brighter future. But now, in this quiet moment with Tala, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Tala's words stayed with him long after she had returned to the cabin. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Caleb sat on the porch, looking out over the ranch. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just existing. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for all of them. That night, as they sat around the fire, Caleb couldn't shake the thought that had been lingering in his mind all day. Maybe the pain didn't have to define them. Maybe they could all heal together and find peace in a world that had so often been harsh and unforgiving. The conversation around the fire was light, filled with small talk and stories of the past. Ahuli, who had been quieter than usual, finally spoke up. "I remember when we were children," she said, her voice soft and distant. "We used to play by the river near our village. The water was cold, but we didn't mind. We would spend hours there just laughing and playing. It feels like a lifetime ago." Tala smiled gently, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "We were so young," she said, her voice filled with nostalgia. "We didn't know what was coming. We didn't know that everything would change." The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of shared memories settling over them all. Caleb knew that there were things neither Tala nor Ahuli could fully share with him. Not yet. But he also knew that there was a bond between them that didn't need words. They had all lost something, and in that loss, they had found a kind of understanding that couldn't be explained. As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled above, Caleb found himself thinking about his brother. Isaac had been everything to him, his partner, his friend, his family. Losing him had shattered Caleb's world, and for years, he had carried that brokenness with him. But now, as he sat beside Tala and Ahuli, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. These two girls, though they had their own pain, had become a part of his life in a way he never expected. And they had offered him something he hadn't realized he needed, the possibility of healing. The next morning, as Caleb worked alongside Tala and Ahuli, he felt a shift in his heart. The work still had to be done, the animals still needed tending, the field still needed care, but there was a new lightness in his chest. For the first time in years, Caleb felt like he wasn't just going through the motions, he was living. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future worth looking forward to. Tala and Ahuli worked with quiet determination, their actions speaking more than their words ever could. As the day wore on, Caleb found himself working alongside them without the usual weight of his past pulling at him. It wasn't that he had forgotten about his loss. It would always be with him, a part of who he was. But for the first time in a long time, the pain didn't consume him. He had learned something important. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the scars and finding a way to move forward, no matter how hard it seemed. As they sat together at the end of the day, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Caleb felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be days of doubt, days when the pain of the past would resurface, but he also knew that he wasn't walking that road alone, and that made all the difference. They had all been through their own battles, but in each other, they had found a shared strength, a bond that could not be broken. Together they would face whatever came next. Together they would heal. And in that, Caleb found a kind of hope he never thought he would find again. The days grew warmer as summer stretched its fingers over the desert. The sun blazed high in the sky, and the land shimmered with the heat. But for Caleb, it no longer felt as lonely as it once had. The ranch had become a place of purpose, a place where work and life were shared. Tala and Ahuli had brought something into his world that he hadn't realized he was missing. Companionship, hope, and a sense of belonging. Though the ranch still had its rough edges and needed much work, Caleb felt a deep sense of pride in what he had created here. It was no longer just a place where he tried to bury his past. It was now a place where the future could grow, where new beginnings were possible. Each day, they worked together, Tala helping with the cattle, Ahuli tending to the horses, and Caleb fixing the fences or mending broken tools. It was simple work, but it was meaningful. And even in the long hours, there was a sense of fulfillment in the labor. The ranch had become alive again, not just with the animals, but with the presence of people who cared for it. The land had once felt like a heavy burden to Caleb, but now it was a place of healing, a place where they could build something new. One afternoon, as Caleb stood by the barn wiping sweat from his brow, he noticed Tala and Ahuli sitting under the shade of a large tree. They were talking quietly to each other, their voices drifting on the breeze. Caleb smiled to himself, the familiar sense of peace washing over him. The girls had become like family to him, more than he had ever thought possible. They had filled the space in his heart that had been empty for so long. Tala looked up and noticed him watching. She smiled and waved him over. "Caleb, come sit with us," she called out. "We've been talking about something. We want to ask you something." Curious, Caleb walked over and sat down on the ground next to them. He was still unsure of what they wanted to ask, but there was a calmness in Tala's expression that made him feel like whatever it was, it wouldn't be anything difficult. "What's on your mind?" he asked, settling in beside them. Tala exchanged a glance with Ahuli, who nodded before speaking. "We've been thinking about the future," Tala said, her voice steady but full of hope. "We know you've been here alone for a long time. We've been here for a while now, and we were wondering if maybe we could stay here with you for good." The question hung in the air between them, and Caleb felt a rush of emotions. He hadn't expected this. He had grown used to the idea of the ranch being his, just as he had grown used to being alone. But this idea of a future together was something new, something he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. He looked at the girls, their faces full of hope. He thought of all the long, lonely years he had spent, of the pain that had shaped him and the days when the silence had been so deafening. He had never truly believed that he could have the kind of life they were offering him. But now, looking at the two of them, he felt something stirring inside him. It wasn't just about the work or the ranch, it was about family. It was about the chance to heal, to build something that wasn't just about surviving, but living. Caleb began, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to be asked to keep going, to keep building something with others." Tala smiled, her eyes shining with understanding. "We understand. We know what it's like to carry burdens on your own. We've all been through a lot, but we think together we can make something more than just a place to survive. We can make a home." Caleb's heart tightened as the weight of her words settled in. A home. The idea of it felt both unfamiliar and comforting. He had spent so many years focusing on the survival part of life, keeping the ranch running, keeping his grief buried, that the thought of a real home had never seemed possible. But now, with Tala and Ahuli by his side, the idea no longer felt impossible. It felt like a dream that might actually come true. I would like that," Caleb said finally, his voice rough but sincere. "I would like that very much." Ahuli's eyes softened and she leaned in slightly. "We've always dreamed of a place where we could belong," she said quietly. "And this feels like it could be that place." A sense of calm washed over Caleb as he looked at the two girls. He realized that he wasn't just offering them a place to stay. They were offering him something just as important, a chance to live again, a chance to heal, and a chance to build something stronger than the scars of the past. Over the next few weeks, they worked together to make the ranch truly feel like home. They planted more crops, fixed up the old barn, and added a small garden beside the cabin. Caleb found himself laughing more, talking more, and even sharing stories of his past, something he hadn't done in years. It felt freeing, like the walls he had built around himself were slowly coming down. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the ranch, Caleb couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected turn his life had taken. The future, once a blurry and uncertain thing, now seemed full of promise. He had been given a second chance and he wasn't going to waste it. "This place," Caleb said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "It's more than just land. It's a place to rebuild. A place where we can start over." Tala nodded, her eyes glowing in the soft light of the setting sun. "Exactly," she said. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're living, and that's the most important thing." Caleb smiled, his heart light. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace that had always seemed out of reach. The past would always be a part of him. A part of the land, and the scars he carried would never fully disappear. But now, the scars weren't marks of pain. They were symbols of survival. They were reminders of how far they had come and how much they had to offer each other. And as the fire crackled and the stars began to appear in the night sky, Caleb realized that the ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs. Together, they had turned a place of sorrow into a place of hope, a place where the past no longer defined them, and the future was something they could shape together. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt truly at home.